Renée Adorée was the most profitable workhorse in MGM history, making millions for her boss Louis B. Mayer. But to him, actors weren't human beings. They were just racehorses. And when a racehorse breaks down, you don't fix it. You shoot it. After forcing her into 18-hour shifts until she collapsed on set, coughing up blood from tuberculosis, Mayer didn't call a doctor. He instantly shredded her contract, cut off her income, and threw her out the gates. She was left to die in a lonely sanatorium at 35, purged like a defective product by a ruthless capitalist machine. But to dissect the sheer toxicity of the Hollywood environment that killed her, it is essential to first unmask the physical and psychological baseline of the woman they broke. Renée Adorée was not a fragile, pampered elite who stumbled into the hardships of early film production. She was built of iron. The industry did not crush a delicate flower. It systematically dismantled a hardened survivor. She was born Jeanne de la Font in October 1898 in the industrial city of Lille, in the north of France. Her entry into the world was entirely devoid of glamour or privilege. She was the daughter of working-class circus performers, a demographic that existed on the absolute precarious margins of European society at the turn of the 20th century. From the moment she could walk, she was integrated into the family trade. The reality of traveling circus life in the early 1900s was a daily grinding ordeal of physical endurance, constant transit, and razor-thin profit margins. There were no safety nets, either literal or financial. By the time she was 5 years old, she was performing complex, highly demanding acrobatic routines in front of paying crowds. This environment forged her physical and mental architecture. In the circus, a performer learns very early that survival depends entirely on the ability to push past exhaustion and ignore physical pain. A sprained wrist, a bruised rib, or a severe fever were not acceptable reasons to miss a performance. If you did not perform, you did not eat. This upbringing instilled in her a pathological work ethic and an incredibly high threshold for physical suffering. She was conditioned to view her own body not as something to be nurtured, but as a mechanical tool that must be forced to function regardless of the internal damage. This deep-seated psychological conditioning, the absolute normalization of working through agony, would later become the exact trait that the Hollywood executives would exploit to lethal effect. She would never complain about a 15-hour workday on a film set because, to a woman raised in a traveling circus, working until you collapsed was simply the standard expectation of employment. As she aged into her adolescence, her physical strength and natural grace allowed her to transition from acrobatics to professional dancing. She began touring across Europe, securing positions in various stage revues and theatrical troupes. The constant travel broadened her worldview, but offered no real stability. She was a working-class entertainer relying entirely on her physical stamina to survive. Then in the summer of 1914, the geopolitical structure of the world violently fractured. The outbreak of the First World War turned the European continent into an unprecedented slaughterhouse. Her hometown of Lille, situated near the Belgian border, was positioned directly in the path of the advancing German military machine. The city was subjected to a brutal siege and subsequent occupation. The life she knew was instantly eradicated by artillery fire. At 16 years old, Renée transitioned from an itinerant dancer into a war refugee. The psychological trauma of this period cannot be overstated. She was forced to navigate a continent that was actively tearing itself apart. The roads were choked with displaced civilians, military convoys, and the constant looming threat of violence and starvation. The survival instincts she had developed in the circus were now applied to the desperate reality of staying alive in a war zone. She fled across borders, moving through territories devastated by conflict. Her journey took her far from the familiar landscapes of Western Europe, pushing her deep into Russia, just as the seeds of the 1917 revolution were beginning to take root. The sheer biological endurance required to survive this migration is staggering. She faced malnutrition, exposure to the elements, and the constant psychological terror of being a young, unprotected woman in a landscape defined by military aggression. Yet she survived. When the situation in Russia became too volatile, she managed to secure passage out of the conflict zones entirely, traveling to Australia. She danced in stage productions in Sydney, slowly rebuilding her finances and her life in an unfamiliar hemisphere. Eventually seeking a permanent escape from the lingering poverty and the deep traumatic scars of post-war Europe, she made the decision to migrate to the United States. She arrived in New York City in the early 1920s. She stepped off the boat carrying the heavy invisible baggage of a refugee, but she also carried a physical constitution that had been tested against the harshest environments the early 20th century had to offer. She had survived poverty, child labor, global warfare, and international displacement. She had proven herself to be biologically and psychologically indestructible. New York City in the 1920s was a booming, ruthless metropolis. For an immigrant with no formal education and heavily accented English, the options were severely limited. But Renée possessed a fierce, unyielding ambition and an undeniable exotic physical beauty. She capitalized on her extensive European dance training, securing work in the chorus lines of Broadway musicals and high-end cabarets. She adopted the stage name Renée Adorée, shedding the identity of the traumatized war refugee and actively constructing the persona of a sophisticated French artist. It was during this period of grueling theatrical work that the emerging film industry first took notice of her. The silent film era was expanding at a rapid pace, and talent scouts were constantly scouring the New York stages for highly expressive performers who could convey complex emotions without the use of spoken dialogue. Renée, with her large, deeply expressive eyes and her lifetime of physical conditioning in pantomime and dance, was perfectly suited for the medium. She made the cross-country migration to California, stepping into the dusty, chaotic, rapidly developing world of early Hollywood. The industry she entered was not the polished, highly regulated corporate machine of the later decades. It was a lawless frontier. The studios were essentially massive, unregulated factory towns, operating with absolute impunity. There were no labor unions, no mandated safety protocols, and no limitations on how hard a human being could be pushed to deliver a product. Renée's early years in Hollywood were characterized by the same relentless hustle that had defined her entire life. She secured minor roles working for various small production companies. She quickly built a reputation among directors not just for her acting talent, but for her staggering physical endurance. She never complained about the heat, the dirt, or the long hours. She was a director's dream, a highly capable, utterly uncomplaining worker who would execute whatever was required without hesitation. By 1924, her consistent, high-quality work caught the attention of the executives who were in the process of forming Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. They recognized that beneath her quiet professional demeanor was a raw, intense emotional depth, an authenticity born of actual lived trauma that American-born actresses simply could not replicate. They signed her to a standard studio contract. It was a legal document that bound her to the studio's demands entirely, offering a regular salary, but stripping her of any right to refuse roles or dictate her own schedule. She likely signed it with gratitude, viewing the steady income as the ultimate victory over the poverty she had fled in Europe. She had no way of knowing that the contract was effectively a death warrant. Her transition from a reliable supporting actress to a global superstar was imminent. The studio was preparing to launch an incredibly ambitious, highly expensive project that would require her to draw upon the darkest, most traumatic memories of her youth. They were preparing to film a World War I epic, and they needed a woman who understood the true, terrifying reality of artillery fire to anchor the emotional core of the picture. She was about to step onto the set of the film that would build an empire, completely unaware that the very men who would profit from her performance were actively designing the working conditions that would eventually suffocate her. The transition from an itinerant working-class dancer to a contracted studio asset occurred precisely when the American film industry was undergoing a massive, ruthless corporate consolidation. In 1924, Marcus Lowe orchestrated the merger of Metro Pictures, Goldwyn Pictures, and Louis B. Mayer Productions. The resulting conglomerate, MGM, was a behemoth designed to monopolize the global entertainment market. But to cement their dominance, the newly formed studio needed a flagship product. They needed a critical and commercial earthquake that would legitimize their brand and crush their competitors. That earthquake was a project titled The Big Parade. Directed by King Vidor, The Big Parade was conceived as the ultimate cinematic statement on the First World War. It was a massive departure from the highly romanticized, bloodless war films of the era. Vidor wanted to show the grinding, terrifying reality of the conflict from the perspective of an ordinary American soldier. To anchor the film, the studio cast their most bankable male star, the matinee idol John Gilbert. But the narrative hinged entirely on the emotional weight of the female lead, Melisande, a French farm girl whose home is overrun by the advancing armies and who falls desperately in love with Gilbert's character before he is sent to the front lines. The studio executives reviewed their roster of contracted actresses. They needed a woman who could project genuine, unvarnished terror and profound loss without a single line of spoken dialogue. They chose Renée Adorée. The decision was not driven by artistic sentimentality. It was a calculated extraction of her personal history. The executives knew she was an actual French refugee. They knew she had personally witnessed the artillery fire that destroyed her homeland. They did not just hire her to act the part of a war victim. They hired her to monetize her own deeply buried psychological trauma for the camera. The production of The Big Parade in 1925 was an exercise in physical attrition. To capture the vast scale of the troop movements and the trench warfare, the entire cast and crew were uprooted from California and relocated to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. They were not shooting on a controlled, comfortable soundstage. They were plunged into a harsh, unforgiving environment. The Texas sun was blistering. The sets were vast open fields of dirt, mud, and barbed wire. Vidor utilized thousands of actual United States military personnel as extras, and the filming involved highly dangerous, practical explosions orchestrated by Army engineers. It was an exhausting, dirty, and physically hazardous grind. The days stretched endlessly under the oppressive heat. For the pampered stars of early Hollywood, these conditions frequently led to complaints, delays, and demands for better accommodations. But Renée Adorée did not complain. When the director demanded that she hurl herself through the mud, cling to the side of a moving military convoy, or run frantically through clouds of chemical smoke, she executed the physical blocking perfectly and without hesitation. Her circus upbringing and her refugee survival instincts kicked in completely. She possessed an ironclad work ethic that was entirely foreign to the Hollywood elite. She viewed the grueling Texas shoot not as an artistic hardship, but as a job that simply needed to be finished. When she filmed the iconic, emotionally devastating scene where she chases John Gilbert's transport truck as it departs for the front line, desperately clinging to his boot until she is dragged to the dirt, she was not reaching for a performance. She was tapping directly into the visceral panic of the war she had survived. The camera captured a raw, authentic agony that resonated with millions, but her uncomplaining endurance established a lethal precedent. The studio executives observing the daily reports from Texas took careful note of her behavior. They realized they possessed an actress who would never halt a production, who would never demand a shorter workday, and who would push her physical body past the point of exhaustion simply because she was told to. In the predatory ecosystem of MGM, a worker who does not set boundaries is a worker who will be exploited until they collapse. Her greatest strength, her immense physical and psychological resilience, became the exact mechanism that the studio would use to destroy her. When The Big Parade was released to the public late in 1925, the cultural and financial response was unprecedented. It struck a raw nerve with a global population that was still actively grieving the massive human casualties of the Great War. Audiences lined up around the block in major cities across the world. In New York City alone, the film played continuously at the Astor Theater for an astonishing 96 weeks. The financial return was staggering. Produced on a budget of just $382,000, The Big Parade generated an estimated $15 million in box office revenue. To put this in perspective for the modern economic landscape, it was the equivalent of a multi-billion-dollar blockbuster. It became the highest-grossing silent film of all time. That money did not just make the executives wealthy, it built the physical and corporate infrastructure of MGM. The massive influx of cash allowed Louis B. Mayer and his head of production, Irving Thalberg, to purchase vast tracts of real estate in Culver City, constructing sprawling backlots and state-of-the-art sound stages. The profits from Renée Adorée's performance quite literally poured the concrete foundation of the most powerful entertainment monopoly on the planet. Mayer became the highest-paid executive in the United States, and MGM became the undisputed king of Hollywood. Renée Adorée was suddenly a global icon. Her face was printed in magazines across Europe and America. Louis B. Mayer publicly paraded her at lavish industry banquets, referring to her as the treasure of the studio. However, this public adoration was a carefully constructed corporate illusion designed to mask a brutal economic reality. Legally and financially, Renée was not a partner in this massive success. She did not receive a percentage of the $15 million gross. She did not receive stock options in the company she had just built. She was operating under a standard flat-rate studio contract. She was simply a highly recognizable, ununionized employee. Her reward for generating the capital that built MGM was not financial independence or artistic freedom. Her reward was a mandate to work even harder. To understand why the studio system was so inherently cruel, one must analyze the root cause of its corporate structure. Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg did not view filmmaking as a collaborative artistic endeavor. They viewed it as industrial manufacturing. They explicitly modeled the MGM studio system on the assembly lines of Henry Ford. In this capitalist model, the actors, directors, and writers were not creatives. They were fixed overhead costs. If an actress is being paid a flat weekly salary of a few $1,000s, the only mathematical way for the studio to maximize the return on that investment is to keep her standing in front of a camera for as many hours as physically possible. Idle time was categorized as lost revenue. Therefore, to capitalize on her newly minted global fame, MGM subjected Renée to a non-stop punishing production schedule. There was no resting on her laurels, no extended vacations to recover from the grueling Texas shoot. She was immediately scheduled to shoot 4 to 5 massive feature films a year. She was constantly moving from one production to the next, often filming scenes for different movies on the same day. In the late 1920s, the Hollywood factory floor was effectively a lawless frontier for labor rights. The Screen Actors Guild did not yet exist. There were no mandated health insurance policies, no overtime pay structures, and absolutely no legally required rest periods between shooting days. It was an entirely unregulated environment where the employer held absolute dictatorial power. For actors under contract at MGM, 15 to 18-hour workdays were the standard expectation. If a director fell behind schedule and wanted to shoot through the night to save money on set rentals, the actors stayed on their marks until the sun came up. If an actor complained of exhaustion or requested a day off to recover from an illness, they were immediately threatened with suspension without pay, which also automatically extended the duration of their restrictive contract. But the sheer length of the workdays was only one component of the danger. The physical environment of a 1920s film set was literally, acutely toxic. To fully grasp the biological assault Renée endured, one must look closely at the architecture of the early sound stages. These were not modern, climate-controlled facilities. They were massive, unventilated warehouses completely sealed off from natural light and fresh air to prevent any external interference with the filming process. Inside these sealed boxes, the studios utilized orthochromatic film stock, which required blinding, unnatural amounts of light to properly expose an image. To generate this light, the industry relied heavily on carbon arc lamps, commonly known as Klieg lights. These massive lamps operated by sparking a continuous high-voltage electrical current between two carbon rods. The Klieg lights were notoriously hazardous. They emitted intense ultraviolet radiation, which frequently burned the corneas of the actors, causing a painful, temporary blindness known in the industry as Klieg eyes. But the more insidious danger was respiratory. As the carbon rods burned at incredibly high temperatures, they spewed a continuous heavy rain of fine carbon dust and toxic industrial fumes directly into the stagnant, unventilated air of the soundstage. For 15 to 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, Renée Adorée breathed in this dense atmosphere of suspended particulate matter. The human respiratory system is a highly efficient filter, but it was not designed to process the continuous inhalation of industrial carbon. And the Klieg lights were only the baseline of the toxicity. The special effects of the silent era were entirely practical and entirely unregulated. If a script called for a beautiful romantic winter scene, stagehands positioned on catwalks above the set would dump bags of pure, unrefined asbestos flakes over the actors to simulate falling snow. The actors would stand in this carcinogenic blizzard, inhaling the microscopic fibers deep into their lungs while delivering their performances. If a scene required a foggy, atmospheric aesthetic in a tavern or a battlefield, the crew ignited chemical smoke pots in enclosed spaces, filling the unventilated warehouse with thick, noxious fumes. Renée Adorée was subjected to this environment continuously. She was a highly paid, glamorous star on the covers of international magazines, but in biological terms, she was a blue-collar worker operating in a severely hazardous industrial factory with zero occupational safety standards. The circus had tested her muscular endurance, and the war had tested her psychological fortitude. But the MGM factory floor was quietly, efficiently, and systematically destroying her respiratory system from the inside out. Every breath she took on the set deposited a fresh layer of toxic material into her lungs. Her immune system was constantly fighting to clear the debris, but her body was never granted the rest required to heal. She was chronically sleep-deprived, malnourished by the erratic catering of the studio schedules, and operating under the immense constant pressure to perform. Louis B. Mayer watched the daily film rushes, noted her flawless performances, and continued to schedule her for back-to-back productions. He did not see a human being whose internal organs were taking catastrophic daily damage. He saw an asset, and in the logic of industrial capitalism, assets must be aggressively depreciated to extract maximum value before they break down entirely. Renée pushed forward, utilizing her deep-seated immigrant work ethic to ignore the growing fatigue and the persistent nagging cough that had begun to develop. She believed that hard work was the only mechanism for survival. She did not realize that by being the perfect, uncomplaining employee, she was actively participating in her own slow execution. The physical toll was mounting with every passing month. But as the 1920s drew to a close, a new, completely unprecedented threat appeared on the horizon. The physical exhaustion and environmental poisoning she was enduring were about to be compounded by a technological earthquake. An innovation was sweeping through the industry that would attack her mind long before her body completely failed, introducing a level of psychological terror that would push her compromised immune system past the point of no return. The microphone was coming to Hollywood. The technological earthquake that permanently fractured the Hollywood ecosystem arrived in 1927 with the release of The Jazz Singer. The successful synchronization of sound and moving image was not merely an artistic evolution, it was a violent, overnight industrial revolution. The major studios, initially hesitant to absorb the massive costs of retrofitting their sound stages and theaters, quickly realized that the public appetite for talkies was insatiable. Within months, the silent film, the medium that had built the financial empires of men like Louis B. Mayer, was declared commercially dead. The industry pivoted with ruthless, panicked speed. But this transition introduced a new, terrifying metric of human viability into the studio system: the microphone. For the actors who had clawed their way to the top of the silent era, the microphone was not a tool. It was an executioner's blade hanging directly over their livelihoods. In the silent era, acting was an entirely physical discipline. Performers relied on facial expressions, bodily kinetics, and the universal language of pantomime to convey complex narratives. An actor's voice, their accent, and their natural diction were entirely irrelevant. Title cards translated their performances perfectly to audiences in Ohio, London, and Tokyo alike. But the introduction of audio completely annihilated this universal translation. Suddenly, how an actor sounded was the sole determining factor in whether they retained their employment. For Renée Adorée, the advent of sound was a waking nightmare. As a French immigrant who had arrived in the United States as a young adult, she possessed a heavy, distinct, and unmistakable accent. Her English was functional, but her vowels were deeply rooted in her European upbringing. Overnight, the studio executives at MGM completely shifted their perspective on her. The woman who had generated the $15 million that built their sound stages was no longer viewed as their prized dramatic anchor. She was instantly classified as a massive financial liability. The men in the boardrooms looked at demographic data and determined that Middle America would not easily understand her. They feared her accent would alienate the ticket-buying public. The very identity that had made her an exotic, captivating star was now treated as a corporate defect. If MGM had operated with even a fraction of human empathy, they would have paused her grueling production schedule to allow her to adapt to this terrifying new medium. They would have provided her with the time and resources to safely transition her skill set. But empathy does not maximize quarterly profits. Louis B. Mayer did not lessen her workload by a single hour. Instead, he forced a staggering, impossible double burden onto her already failing physical infrastructure. She was ordered to maintain her standard 15-hour daily shooting schedule on the toxic, unventilated sound stages. However, during the brief windows of time previously allocated for her basic recovery and sleep, she was mandated to undergo intense daily vocal coaching. The studio hired aggressive elocution instructors whose sole objective was to systematically strip away her French accent and replace it with a flat mid-Atlantic American diction. The psychological strain of this process was immense and deeply humiliating. After spending the entire day performing under the blistering heat of the Klieg lights, inhaling carbon dust and asbestos, she was forced to sit in a small room and endlessly repeat phonetic exercises. She was treated like a defective piece of machinery being recalibrated. The instructors scrutinized every syllable, criticizing the natural shape of her words. She was fighting against her own vocal cords, desperately trying to unlearn the language of her youth to satisfy the demands of men who viewed her only as a line item on a budget spreadsheet. This brutal schedule eradicated any remaining margins for physical rest. She was operating on a severe chronic sleep deficit, but the lack of sleep was only the biological component of her deterioration. The psychological terror of her environment accelerated the collapse. MGM in the late 1920s was saturated with paranoia. Renée watched her peers, the titans of the silent screen, systematically destroyed by the studio over their speaking voices. The most devastating example was right in front of her. John Gilbert, her co-star from The Big Parade. Gilbert possessed a perfectly acceptable tenor voice, but Louis B. Mayer actively despised him due to personal and financial disputes. Mayer deliberately used the transition to sound as a weapon to sabotage Gilbert's career, casting him in poorly written roles and allegedly manipulating sound equipment to make his voice sound thin and comical to audiences. Gilbert was humiliated, his career shredded, and his psychological state completely broken by the very studio he had helped to build. Renée witnessed this destruction firsthand. She realized with terrifying clarity that she was entirely disposable. She understood that her past contributions, the millions of dollars she had earned for the company, and her flawless work ethic offered absolutely no protection. If Mayer was willing to publicly execute the career of John Gilbert, he would not hesitate to discard a French immigrant the moment her accent failed to test well with audiences. The fear of losing everything she had sacrificed her youth to build triggered a state of constant, unyielding physiological stress. The human body is designed to handle acute stress in short bursts, releasing cortisol and adrenaline to survive immediate threats. It is not designed to sustain that chemical state indefinitely. The constant anxiety over her vocal performances, combined with the fear of imminent termination, kept her nervous system locked in a permanent fight or flight response. This sustained flood of stress hormones actively, aggressively suppressed her immune system. Her white blood cell count plummeted. Her body, completely depleted of its natural defenses, was left wide open to the biological hazards circulating in the stagnant air of the studio. The inevitable biological surrender arrived in 1930. MGM cast her in a production titled Call of the Flesh, a romantic drama starring the popular leading man Ramon Novarro. It was an early talkie, which meant the pressure to deliver flawless audio dialogue was at its absolute peak. The heavy, soundproof doors of the soundstage were sealed tight to prevent any outside noise from bleeding into the rudimentary microphones. The air inside the warehouse was thick with heat, industrial exhaust, and the sweat of the crew. During the filming, the nagging, persistent cough that Renée had been attempting to suppress for months violently escalated. It was no longer a dry reflex clearing carbon dust from her throat. The cough became deep, rattling, and productive. Her energy reserves, which had sustained her through circus acrobatics and war zones, finally hit absolute zero. While executing a scene on the set, her body simply gave out. Her legs buckled under her weight. She collapsed onto the floor of the sound stage, unable to draw enough oxygen into her system to remain conscious. And then the most terrifying, undeniable symptom manifested. As she gasped for air on the studio floor, she began to violently cough up bright red blood. The medical diagnosis was swift, unambiguous, and grim: severe pulmonary tuberculosis. To fully grasp the gravity of this diagnosis, it is necessary to strip away the romanticized Victorian notions of consumption and examine tuberculosis for what it truly was in the early 1930s. It was a brutal, highly contagious, and frequently lethal bacterial infection. The antibiotic streptomycin, which would eventually make the disease curable, would not be discovered for another decade and a half. A diagnosis of tuberculosis in 1930 was widely considered a drawn-out death sentence. Tuberculosis is caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis. When inhaled, these bacteria travel deep into the alveoli of the lungs. In a healthy human being with a robust immune system, white blood cells immediately surround the bacteria, forming hard calcified shells called granulomas to contain the infection. The person may carry the bacteria for their entire life without ever developing the active disease. But Renée Adorée did not have a robust immune system. Her immune response had been systematically annihilated by years of severe sleep deprivation, psychological terror, and malnutrition. Furthermore, her lung tissue had been heavily scarred and compromised by years of inhaling carbon dust, asbestos, and chemical smoke on the MGM sets. Her respiratory system was a structurally weakened environment entirely incapable of fighting off an invasion. Because her body could not contain the bacteria, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis began to actively multiply and consume her lung tissue from the inside out. The bacteria secrete enzymes that literally dissolve the healthy cells of the lungs, creating expanding necrotic cavities within the chest. The body attempts to fight this tissue death with massive inflammation, which fills the lungs with fluid. The bright red blood she coughed onto the floor of the soundstage was the direct result of the bacteria eroding the blood vessels within her decaying lung tissue. Renée Adorée did not just have a stroke of bad luck. She did not merely catch a passing illness. She had contracted an industrial disease. The tuberculosis thrived in her body specifically because the Hollywood studio system had spent the last 6 years meticulously breaking down every single biological barrier she possessed. When their leading lady collapsed and began bleeding from her lungs, the reaction of the MGM executive structure was a masterclass in corporate sociopathy. The standard humane response to a medical emergency of that magnitude is to immediately halt production, summon an ambulance, and transport the victim to a specialized hospital for intensive care. But Louis B. Mayer and his production managers did not look at Renée and see a dying woman. They looked at the production schedule for Call of the Flesh and saw a financial liability. They had hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in the film. Halting the production to recast and reshoot her scenes would cost the studio a fraction of the profits they made in a single week, but it was a cost they absolutely refused to absorb. Instead of ordering medical evacuation, the studio executives initiated a cover-up to protect their shooting schedule. They dispatched studio doctors to the set. These physicians were a dark, heavily utilized reality of the early Hollywood system. They were medical professionals who operated essentially on the studio payroll, and their primary mandate was not the long-term health of the patient, but the immediate continuation of the filming process. They were the mechanics tasked with keeping the human machinery moving at all costs. When these studio doctors examined Renée, they did not order her to bed rest. They opened their medical bags and prepared syringes. The historical record of this era details the widespread practice of injecting exhausted, collapsing actors with vitamin boosters. These injections were rarely just vitamins. They were highly potent, unregulated cocktails, frequently laced with heavy stimulants, amphetamines, and powerful painkillers. The studio doctors injected the dying actress with these chemical stimulants. The drugs forcefully bypassed her body's desperate biological signals for rest, artificially spiking her heart rate and pumping synthetic energy into her failing nervous system. They literally propped her up. They patched her together with speed and painkillers, applied heavier makeup to mask the ghastly, hollow pallor of her skin, and pushed her back under the Klieg lights. MGM forced a woman whose lungs were actively dissolving and who was actively bleeding internally to stand on her marks and deliver her dialogue. They extracted the final necessary scenes of Call of the Flesh through an act of sheer medical abuse. They kept the cameras rolling until they had enough usable footage to ensure their financial investment was secure. They wrung the absolute last drop of commercial viability out of her failing body. Only when the director finally called wrap on her, required scenes, and her presence was no longer legally or financially necessary for the completion of the film, was she finally permitted to seek legitimate medical attention. Independent specialists examined her outside the jurisdiction of the studio lot. They reviewed her chest x-rays and delivered the terrifying reality of her condition. The tuberculosis was severe and advanced. There was no quick remedy. The doctors informed her that her only chance of survival was immediately checking into a specialized sanatorium. She would require several years of complete, uninterrupted bed rest in a dry, high-altitude climate, accompanied by round-the-clock nursing care and a strict dietary regimen to help her body attempt to wall off the infection. She could not act. She could not fulfill the grueling requirements of a soundstage. She was completely, indefinitely incapacitated. This medical verdict was formally delivered to the executive offices of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The studio was now faced with an undeniable reality. Their $15 million star, the woman whose physical labor had poured the concrete of their empire, was critically ill and required immediate, massive financial and medical support to save her own life. The executives took the medical reports, walked into the office of Louis B. Mayer, and prepared to make a decision that would lay bare the absolute, terrifying cruelty of the capitalist machine. The medical verdict delivered to the executive offices of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was unequivocal. The independent specialists who examined Renée Adorée confirmed that she was suffering from advanced severe pulmonary tuberculosis. The disease had heavily infiltrated her lungs, and her physical reserves were entirely depleted. She could not act. She could not stand under the Klieg lights. Her only chance of survival was immediate, indefinite confinement to a specialized sanatorium for years of complete bed rest. The studio was now forced to confront a profound moral and financial test. The woman lying in a hospital bed had been the central pillar of their empire. Just 5 years prior, her performance in the big parade had generated the $15 million that transformed MGM from a struggling merger into the undisputed titan of the global entertainment industry. She had worked 15-hour days, ruined her vocal cords to appease their demands for the microphone, and inhaled the toxic dust of their sound stages until her respiratory system collapsed. The question was simple. How would a multi-million-dollar corporation care for the worker who had sacrificed her life to build their fortune? The answer provided by Louis B. Mayer remains one of the most chilling, defining acts of corporate cruelty in the history of American cinema. Mayer did not view the medical report as a human tragedy. He viewed it strictly as a breach of contract. In the executive mindset of the 1930s studio system, an actor was a depreciating capital asset. As long as the asset was generating revenue, it was maintained. The precise second the asset ceased to be profitable and required expensive maintenance, it was liquidated. Mayer did not summon his accountants to establish a health fund for his dying star. He did not allocate a fraction of a percent of the millions she had earned the studio to cover her medical bills. Instead, he summoned his legal department. The studio contracts of the Golden Age were draconian documents, heavily weighted entirely in favor of the employer. They granted the studio absolute ownership over an actor's image, schedule, and career, but they offered absolutely zero reciprocal loyalty or protection. Embedded deep within these contracts were strict morality and health clauses. These clauses were not designed to protect the well-being of the actor. They were legal tripwires designed to protect the studio from financial liability. If an actor became incapacitated, fell pregnant, or suffered a scandal that hindered their ability to work, the studio possessed the unilateral right to instantly terminate their employment without penalty. Louis B. Mayer invoked this clause without a moment of hesitation. He did not offer her a leave of absence. He did not suspend her contract temporarily to allow her to heal. He executed the contract completely. With a stroke of a pen, he legally and permanently terminated Renée Adorée's employment at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The execution was swift and surgically precise. The exact moment she needed financial support the most, the moment her life depended entirely on securing expensive long-term medical care, MGM cut off her only source of income. There was no severance package. There was no pension. There was no corporate safety net. She was dumped out of the studio system and abandoned to face a terminal illness entirely alone. The capitalist machine had extracted the final drop of value from her exhausted body during the filming of Call of the Flesh, and having secured their product, they threw the broken machinery onto the scrap heap. The psychological devastation of this betrayal cannot be overstated. Renée had operated under the immigrant belief that absolute loyalty and uncomplaining hard work would guarantee security. She had given the studio her youth, her health, and her unquestioning obedience. To be fired while actively bleeding from the lungs, to be discarded so clinically by the men who called her their treasure at industry banquets, shattered her completely. The illusion of the Hollywood family was violently ripped away, exposing the cold, indifferent steel of the factory floor. Stripped of her studio salary, Renée faced an immediate, terrifying financial crisis. The cost of tuberculosis treatment in the early 1930s was astronomical. Because there were no antibiotics to cure the infection, the only medical protocol was to isolate the patient in a highly controlled environment and hope their immune system could eventually wall off the bacteria. This required checking into a private sanatorium, usually located in dry, high-altitude climates. These facilities were incredibly expensive. Patients were billed for long-term room and board, specialized dietary regimens required to rebuild lost tissue, and round-the-clock intensive nursing care to manage the severe hemorrhaging and fevers. To afford a bed in a sanatorium in Sunland, California, located in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, Renée was forced to rapidly and systematically liquidate her life. The wealth she had accumulated was entirely insufficient to cover years of specialized medical confinement. She began selling off her personal assets. She sold her jewelry. She sold her luxury vehicles. Eventually, the woman who had anchored the highest-grossing film in the world was forced to sell her Hollywood home just to ensure she was not thrown out onto the street while she struggled to breathe. She was watching the physical evidence of her entire career evaporate to pay the doctors. The historical contrast during this period is sickening to observe. It offers a stark split-screen view of the deep structural inequality of the studio era. On one side of the screen, you have Renée Adorée lying in a narrow, sterile bed in Sunland. She is isolated, physically wasting away, and entirely consumed by the terrifying mechanics of drawing her next breath. She is watching her bank accounts drain, completely abandoned by the industry she helped build. On the other side of the screen, just a few miles away in Culver City, Louis B. Mayer is at the absolute terrifying peak of his executive power. He is hosting lavish champagne-soaked banquets. He is overseeing the rapid expansion of the MGM backlots, purchasing more real estate with the profits generated by silent film stars. He is actively utilizing his immense wealth and political influence to aggressively lobby against the formation of the Screen Actors Guild, terrified that if actors unionized, they might demand basic human rights like health insurance and mandated rest periods. The studio system continued to print money, completely undisturbed by the fact that one of its primary architects was suffocating in isolation. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to. Yet, within this bleak landscape of institutional sociopathy, a profound act of charity emerged. It did not come from the executives, the producers, or the studio boardrooms. It came directly from the factory floor. It came from the workers. When word quietly circulated through the Hollywood underground that Renée had been fired and was rapidly running out of the funds necessary to stay in the sanatorium, the studio turned a blind eye. But her fellow actress, Marion Davies, did not. History has frequently and unfairly reduced Marion Davies to a mere footnote, framing her simply as the glamorous mistress of the ruthless publishing tycoon William Randolph Hearst. But within the acting community of the 1920s and 1930s, Davies was deeply respected. She was known as one of the most fiercely loyal, generous, and empathetic figures in the industry. She understood the precarious, dangerous reality of being a contracted actress. She knew exactly how quickly the studio bosses would destroy a woman the moment she ceased to be useful. Davies did not issue a press release. She did not seek public credit or use the situation to burnish her own reputation. When she learned of the financial terror Renée was facing, she quietly and discreetly stepped in. Davies opened her own checkbook and began paying for much of Renée's ongoing, exorbitant medical care. She ensured that the dying actress would not be evicted from the sanatorium. This act of solidarity is deeply revealing. It proves that the funds existed. It proves that providing care for a dying colleague was not financially impossible. The multi-million-dollar corporation that had profited directly from Renée's physical destruction absolutely refused to spend a single dime to ease her suffering. It required the private empathy of a fellow worker, another woman operating within the same predatory ecosystem, to ensure that Renée was granted a basic measure of dignity in her final years. Secured in the sanatorium by the grace of a peer, Renée Adorée settled into the grim, terrifying routine of the chronically ill. She was removed from the public eye, effectively buried alive while her body waged a brutal, losing war against the bacteria consuming her chest. She had survived the battlefields of Europe, but she was now trapped in a battle she could not win, waiting in the quiet foothills of California for the final, inevitable collapse of her remaining strength. The reality of a tuberculosis sanatorium in the early 1930s was an exercise in systematic, institutionalized isolation. Secured in her bed by the private financial intervention of Marion Davies, Renée Adorée entered the final, most grueling phase of her physical decline. The medical establishment of the era possessed absolutely no pharmacological cure for the mycobacterium tuberculosis that was actively excavating her lungs. Without antibiotics, doctors relied on a regime of extreme biological endurance, attempting to manipulate the patient's environment to buy the immune system enough time to fight the infection to a standstill. The treatments were primitive, invasive, and frequently excruciating. To fully understand the physical reality of her final 2 years, one must examine the barbaric mechanics of 1930s respiratory medicine. The primary strategy was absolute enforced immobility. Patients were confined to their beds for months and sometimes years at a time. The theory dictated that any physical exertion, even the act of walking across a room, would increase the respiratory rate and provide the bacteria with more oxygen to fuel their destruction of the lung tissue. For a woman whose entire identity had been defined by profound physical kinetics, from the acrobatic rings of the European circus to the frantic mud-soaked trenches of the Hollywood backlot, this enforced paralysis was a unique form of physiological torture. Her muscles, hardened by decades of relentless athletic labor, began to rapidly atrophy. The body that had carried her across a war-torn continent was methodically wasting away beneath thin hospital sheets. When absolute rest failed to halt the internal hemorrhaging, the physicians resorted to aggressive surgical interventions. The most common procedure for advanced tuberculosis during this period was the artificial pneumothorax. Doctors would insert a long, hollow needle directly through the patient's chest wall, between the ribs, and pump sterile air into the pleural cavity. The goal was to manually collapse the infected lung, forcing it to deflate completely so the diseased tissue could theoretically rest and heal. It was a brutal, highly painful procedure performed without the benefit of modern anesthesia. It had to be repeated regularly as the air was absorbed by the body. Renée was subjected to these violent medical mechanics, enduring the sharp, invasive pain of the needles and the terrifying sensation of forced suffocation as her lung capacity was deliberately avid. Yet the physical agony of the treatments was frequently eclipsed by the profound psychological terror of her environment. Tuberculosis wards were defined by their silence. Patients were actively discouraged from speaking, laughing, or crying, as any vocal exertion could trigger a fatal hemorrhage. For Renée, a woman accustomed to the chaotic, high-decibel environment of theatrical stages and film sets, the silence was deafening. She was trapped inside her own mind, surrounded by the constant ambient sounds of other patients coughing, choking, and quietly dying in the adjacent beds. The psychological isolation was absolute. The Hollywood machinery that had dictated her every waking moment completely vanished. The studio handlers, the directors, and the press agents who had orchestrated her life ceased to exist. She was no longer a profitable commodity. She was a medical liability, and therefore she was rendered entirely invisible. The loss of agency was total. She was stripped of her glamorous persona, her career, and her autonomy. She lay in the quiet foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, provided with ample time to dissect the precise mechanics of her own betrayal. She was forced to confront the stark reality that her unquestioning loyalty to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, her willingness to inhale asbestos, work 15-hour shifts, and sacrifice her vocal cords had not purchased her security. It had merely accelerated her execution. In a desperate bid to arrest the progression of the disease, she engaged in a futile migration. Seeking the driest, most arid air possible, she was moved from the facility in Sunland, California, to a specialized clinic in Prescott, Arizona. It was a physical retreat into the desert, chasing a geographic cure that simply did not exist. The desert air could not rebuild the necrotic tissue in her chest. By 1933, the infection had spread too far. Her remaining lung capacity was catastrophically compromised. The bacteria had systematically dismantled her respiratory infrastructure, leaving her body entirely starved of oxygen. In the autumn of 1933, she was transported back to the Sunland Sanatorium in California. The doctors recognized that all medical interventions had failed. The treatment shifted from attempting to cure the disease to merely managing the pain of her inevitable death. On October 9, 1933, the biological engine that had survived child labor, global warfare, and the ruthless exploitation of the American studio system finally stalled. Her lungs ceased to function. Renée Adorée died in her sanatorium bed. She was 34 years old. She died just weeks shy of her 35th birthday. Her death at such a young age underscores the sheer velocity of the corporate extraction she endured. The studio system did not slowly age her out of the industry. It consumed her entire life force in less than a decade. The moment her pulse stopped, the exact same corporate entity that had fired her, canceled her income, and abandoned her to suffocate immediately sprang into action. The reaction of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to the death of Renée Adorée is a masterclass in the weaponization of public relations and corporate hypocrisy. Louis B. Mayer and the executive board did not view her corpse with guilt or remorse. They viewed it as a sudden, highly useful marketing opportunity. In life, a severely ill actress was a financial drain. In death, she was instantly transformed back into a valuable, static asset. She could no longer demand a salary. She could no longer require medical care. And most importantly, she could no longer speak out against the working conditions that had killed her. She was a blank canvas upon which the studio could project a narrative of their own design. MGM immediately deployed its massive publicity department to control the story. They flooded the national press with highly sanitized, deeply emotional press releases. They announced her death not as the inevitable result of industrial poisoning and corporate neglect, but as a tragic, unavoidable act of God. They framed her passing as a romantic, heartbreaking loss to the artistic community. The studio executives orchestrated a lavish, highly publicized funeral. Louis B. Mayer, the man who had invoked a legal clause to strip her of her health insurance while she was bleeding, sent massive, ostentatious floral arrangements to drape over her casket. The studio suspended production on several lots for a few minutes of silent mourning, ensuring that the entertainment journalists were present to document their profound manufactured grief. They publicly eulogized her as their lost star and a beloved daughter of the MGM family. This corporate necromancy was not merely an exercise in bad taste. It was a highly calculated strategic diversion. By dominating the narrative of her death with overwhelming performative grief, MGM effectively prevented the public and the press from asking the dangerous questions. The floral arrangements and the press releases served as a smokescreen. They ensured that no investigative journalist looked too closely at the carbon dust emitting from the Klieg lights. They ensured that no one scrutinized the 15-hour workdays, the forced injections of synthetic stimulants, or the brutal termination of her contract. By pretending to be her mourning family, the studio legally and historically absolved itself of the murder they had committed by proxy. To fully grasp the sinister nature of this PR strategy, one must examine the specific historical context of 1933. Renée Adorée died at the exact epicenter of a massive labor crisis in Hollywood. The brutal working conditions, the arbitrary pay cuts, and the dictatorial control exerted by the studio bosses had finally pushed the acting community to the breaking point. In 1933, the exact year of her death, a group of actors secretly met to formalize the creation of the Screen Actors Guild. The foundation of the union was a direct response to the exact corporate abuses that had destroyed Renée. Actors were demanding regulated working hours, mandatory turnaround times for sleep, safe working environments, and the very basic human right to medical care. Louis B. Mayer viewed the formation of this union as an existential threat to his capitalist empire. He actively, aggressively fought to crush the labor movement, utilizing intimidation, blacklisting, and coercion to prevent his actors from signing union cards. Therefore, the studio's frantic effort to romanticize Renée's death was a desperate attempt to suppress a labor revolt. If the acting community and the public had fully understood that MGM had literally worked a 34-year-old woman to death and then thrown her in the trash to avoid paying her medical bills, the outrage would have supercharged the unionization efforts. Mayer sent flowers to her funeral because it was significantly cheaper than granting his remaining employees health insurance. He used the corpse of the woman he destroyed to maintain the exact system that killed her. The legacy of Renée Adorée is not found in the glamorous silver gelatin prints of her face. It is found in the dark, unventilated corners of the Hollywood factory floor. Her trajectory serves as a permanent damning indictment of a corporate ecosystem that stripped human beings of their biological dignity to manufacture cheap escapism. We look back at the golden age of Hollywood with a deeply flawed, nostalgic reverence. We admire the sprawling sets, the dazzling costumes, and the seemingly immortal beauty of the silent stars. But the celluloid physical permanence is an illusion purchased with actual human blood. The studio system operated on the fundamental capitalist principle that human labor is entirely disposable. The executives demanded absolute perfection, unyielding obedience, and the total surrender of physical health. Renée Adorée believed the lie. She believed that her resilience, her talent, and her staggering capacity for hard work would protect her. She used her youth, her iron constitution forged in the fires of a world war, and her very lifeblood to construct the golden throne upon which Louis B. Mayer sat. She generated the capital that built the most powerful entertainment monopoly on the planet. And in return, the system audited her failing lungs, calculated the profit margins of her survival, handed her a termination paper, and left her to suffocate in the dark. The tragedy of Renée Adorée is that she survived the worst horrors the early 20th century had to offer: the poverty of the itinerant circus and the artillery fire of a global war, only to be clinically, efficiently dismantled by the American entertainment industry. Her life stands as a brutal, unvarnished reminder that behind the brightest, most intoxicating lights of the cultural machine, the gears are frequently lubricated by the silent, unacknowledged suffering of the workers who are forced to turn them. To the men who controlled the cameras, she was never a human being. She was a highly profitable mechanism, and when the mechanism broke, it was simply swept off the sound stage floor, leaving nothing behind but a $15 million profit margin and a carefully worded press release.